This is Andrea Peters with the World Socialist website. On today's program, we are continuing our two-part series marking the 75th anniversary of the assassination of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, who alongside Lenin led the Russian Revolution of 1917, was killed by an agent of Stalin's secret police, the GPU, in August 1940 at his home in exile in Coyoacán, Mexico. Our guest is David North, chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. Last week, David and I spoke about Trotsky's political biography, his contemporary relevance, and the reasons why Stalin sought his death. You can hear that interview online at wsws.org. In the final part of our discussion last Saturday, I asked David about the circumstances surrounding Trotsky's assassination. David was involved in the mid-1970s and early 1980s in an investigation into this question called Security and the Fourth International. Trotsky's assassination was the apogee of a campaign of mass extermination unleashed by Stalin against the entire generation of socialists that had brought about the Russian Revolution. Terrified of the prospect of a mass workers' uprising against the bureaucracy that he led, Stalin was determined to physically destroy the Fourth International, which was founded in 1938 by Trotsky on the basis of a decade and a half of relentless struggle against Stalinism. Prior to Trotsky's assassination, Stalin's GPU agents murdered 4 individuals who were closely associated with Trotsky and the work of the Fourth International, including Trotsky's son, Lev Sedov. The GPU had infiltrated the organization, placing agents in 3 key locales: Paris, New York, and Mexico. Mark Zborowski, about whom we spoke last week, was the agent stationed in France. The GPU had also penetrated the American section of the Trotskyist movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, which was responsible for providing Trotsky's security. David, I'd like to begin by talking about the assassination and how it was prepared. There were 2 attempts on Trotsky's life, the first in May of 1940 and the second successful one in August. The assassin who ultimately murdered Trotsky was a Spaniard by the name of Ramon Mercader. Mercader gained access to Trotsky's household through his association with Sylvia Agaloff, who was a member of the American SWP. Can you talk a little bit more about how Agaloff ended up being this vehicle through which Mercader accessed Trotsky's household?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. I think as we discussed last week, Trotsky's assassination in August 1940 was the outcome of a protracted process of infiltration of the Fourth International. We spent some time last week, as you mentioned, discussing the role of Mark Zborowski, who came to play an absolutely central role in the work of the Fourth International in Paris. He was Sedov's right-hand man, and Zborowski himself worked extremely closely with Lola Estrine, later known as Lola Dalin. As you indicate, in 1939, the question of Stalinist penetration of the Trotskyist movement in North America, the United States, becomes increasingly critical. The war is approaching, and for Stalin, the assassination of Trotsky becomes a central political task, priority. We know this from memoirs which have been written, documents which have emerged. This was viewed by Stalin as an absolutely central task he confronted. He was terrified that Trotsky would be alive once the war began, and it was only a matter of time before the Soviet Union would be dragged into this war, with, as far as Stalin was concerned, absolutely unpredictable consequences. Now, as you say, there were 2 attempts on Trotsky's life. The first took place on May 24th, 1940, in the evening, early morning hours, I think, of May 24th, 25th. And a machine gun squad led by the Mexican painter David Alfaro Siqueiros gained access to Trotsky's villa. They didn't have to blast their way in. They were allowed to come, and the door was opened. It was opened by a guard by the name of Robert Sheldon Hart. After the attempt on Trotsky's life had failed, Sheldon Hart disappeared with the attackers. There were, of course, many questions as to what Sheldon Hart's role was. It was a matter of dispute. It was not clear, though there were many questions about Hart's behavior and many indications that he may well have been involved, including the discovery after he was killed and his apartment was searched. They found a picture of Stalin in his apartment. At any rate, these were one of the questions which we raised, and it was denounced. We were vehemently and bitterly denounced by Joseph Hansen and the SWP, by George Novak. They spoke of the vile job we had done on Robert Sheldon Hart. Eventually, it was established definitively that Hart was a GPU agent. He is listed in the Venona papers, which have become well known. Now, when that attack failed, it was then decided that they would have to try something else, and now Mercader, or as he was then known, Frank Jackson, was selected as the individual who would carry out an assassination. Now, his initial contact with the Fourth International came through a relationship that he established with Sylvia Agaloff, a supporter of the SWP. She was traveling in Europe, and it's important to review how that occurred, again, because it was a pattern which we observe a number of times. In 1938, Louis Boudens, who was at that time the editor of the American Communist Party newspaper, The Daily Worker, introduced Ruby Weil, a member of the Communist Party, to a Soviet intelligence operative working in the United States under the cover of the Russian Red Cross. That was Gregory Rabinovitz. He used a number of aliases, John, Roberts, names, not very impressive names, but that's how he was known. At any rate, Ruby Weil was introduced to Roberts, and a plan was developed that Ruby Weil, who was acquainted with Sylvia Agaloff, a member of the SWP, whom she had known when I think they were both active in the Musty movement in the Workers' Party, that she would accompany Sylvia Agaloff to Paris and arrange for Agaloff to meet Frank Jackson. That's how the contact was made. As far back as 1938, a intimate relationship then developed between Agaloff and Mercader. From the very beginning, there were elements of Mercader or Jackson that were very strange. What was his business? What was his source of income? What was he doing? He portrayed himself as a non-political man, and yet he was evincing great interest in Sylvia Agaloff. They didn't seem to be the perfect partner. There were many elements of that relationship which seemed odd to those who met them both. And she had questions, but for one or another reason, they were never pursued. She also knew, for example, that he traveled on false passports. This was a very dubious man, and for someone who was involved in a political movement, there were enough alarm bells going off to have warranted a great deal of concern. Nevertheless, it was through that connection that when she was down in Mexico, Mercader followed her to Mexico. He began to become acquainted with people inside the villa, or people who knew Trotsky, including friends such as the Rosmer, Albert Rosmer, Marguerite Rosmer. He did all sorts of favors drove people around. He made himself known. People became used to his presence, and eventually he gained access to the villa itself. But it was, in fact, a terrific breakdown in security. A man of that character and that type should never have been anywhere near Trotsky.
So nobody, when he began to develop this set of relationships with people around the Trotskyist movement and around Trotsky's household, nobody then carried out an investigation to try to establish more detail about who this person was prior to letting him in the household?
No one did that. It appears that the infamous dress rehearsal of August 17th, 1940, that is 3 days before Trotsky was actually attacked, he came by the house and he went into Trotsky's office, and it was a dress rehearsal. And Trotsky apparently broke off at a certain point the meeting, left. He seemed somewhat agitated, and he expressed concern for the first time about Jackson. He said that Jackson doesn't behave like a Frenchman. Jackson never took his hat off while he was in his room. Trotsky was something of a stickler when it came to people's personal culture and etiquette. He also noted that Jackson had at one point sat down on his writing table, which he found deeply uncultured. He expressed concern about Jackson. I think he said something to the, we should find out more about this person. But apparently it was not followed up. And he arrived just, again, 3 days later and was again not stopped and allowed to enter Trotsky's office. And Trotsky, apparently in the final moments before he sat down at the table, and Trotsky was still conscious for some time after the attack, he said that he had thought when Jackson walked in, he had thought to himself, this man could kill me.
And Jackson, Mercader, strikes Trotsky with a blow to the head, and Trotsky dies the next day from his wounds. What was the political response to Trotsky's death? Many people, scholars and others, have argued that Trotsky and the Fourth International were isolated politically, but how did the world respond to the news that the Russian revolutionary had been killed?
Well, of course, it was front-page news all over the world. I mean, he was an immense political figure that was recognized. The New York Times editorialized on his death, a nasty editorial, as you can imagine. It, of course, had a profound impact on broad sections of the left intelligentsia, the better elements, such as, for example, the writer James T. Farrell, the author of the famous Studs-Lonigan trilogy, expressed great horror and sadness over what had happened. It was seen as, by those who retained a commitment to socialism and who were not corrupted by Stalinism and by its lies, were horrified by what had happened. He was the last great representative of the October Revolution, and now he was gone. Now, as far as, and I think this is the central question from the standpoint of what we're discussing, did the death of Trotsky mean that Stalinism no longer viewed the Trotskyist movement as a threat? Far from it. We know, again, on the basis of documents which were to emerge in later years, that the penetration of the Trotskyist movement continued. It became, in fact, even more intense. There were a tremendous level of surveillance and activity, particularly in the Socialist Workers' Party. And one should keep in mind that the concern over the Trotskyist movement and its political potential was not confined to the Stalinists. In 1941, 18 leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party, including James Buchanan, Felix Morrow, were indicted on sedition charges. The Stalinists supported that. The Stalinists provided material which was used by the American state to prosecute the Trotskyists, and they went to jail. So there was obviously, in a bourgeois democracy, there was sufficient concern over the work of the Trotskyists to organize a prosecution against them. One can imagine what the attitude of the Stalinist regime was, even after the death of Trotsky. They didn't believe that the Trotskyist danger was now over. They viewed the Fourth International still as a major threat.
And my understanding is that actually the U.S. government refused to allow Trotsky's body to be brought back to the United States. It was buried in Mexico, and there were hundreds of thousands of workers who turned out for his funeral. Is that correct?
There were 300,000 people who turned out. The event was described to me many years later by Harold Robbins, who was the captain of Trotsky's Guard. It was an extraordinary outpouring of sympathy for Trotsky, something which continued for decades. I recall when I went to Mexico in 1975 for the first time, I encountered many people who remembered Trotsky. There was a great pride among Mexicans that their country had given Trotsky asylum. And perhaps this is something of a digression, but I spoke at one point, as I was trying to gather material, I spoke to the son of Judge Trujillo. He had himself become a judge, but his father was the Judge Trujillo who in 1940 took Trotsky's deposition after the May 24th attack. And he was a very wealthy family. This was a big bourgeois family. And I interviewed him in this magnificent hacienda where he lived. But he was very pleased to speak to me because his family was very proud of its association with Trotsky. And he said to me that after the deposition, he referred to Trotsky as Don Leon.
I'm sorry, which deposition?
His deposition, Trotsky gave a deposition after the May 24th attack. There was actually an official investigation. And there were efforts by some, and certainly by the Stalinists, to claim that Trotsky had orchestrated the assault on himself. All the machine gun fire and everything else was arranged by himself to gather sympathy. Well, this was obviously a flat-out lie. People saw through that. And there was an investigation. At any rate, Trujillo, the judge, conducted the deposition in a manner which Trotsky believed was very principled. And when he left, he told the press that the judge, Trujillo, was an honorable man. And 35 years later, his son says to me, Don Leon said my father was an honorable man, and that was a great tribute to our family, and it had a profound effect on the reputation of our family in Mexico. So that gives one some sense of the esteem with which Trotsky was held.
Now, you spoke to Trujillo when you were involved in this investigation that you carried out in the mid-1970s, security in the Fourth International, and you went down to Mexico. And I know that in addition to speaking to Trujillo, there was also a Mexican journalist, I believe, by the last name is Vargas, who you also spoke to. And could you just tell us a little bit about what he shared with you about his discussions with Trotsky?
Well, he was actually a very well-known journalist, Eduardo Tejas Vargas. There's actually a photograph, a very well-known photograph of Trotsky after Trotsky's death, and of a journalist. He's among the journalists present, and he's in the photograph. But I spoke to him, and I asked him to describe his recollections of Trotsky. And he said he often came to see Trotsky. And Trotsky liked talking to him because he would, among other things, tell him what was going on in Mexico City. He would tell him a lot about the local political life, what was going on. And the last time he saw Trotsky was on August 17th, that Saturday. And he described it to me. He said that he asked Trotsky, did he believe his life was in danger? And Trotsky said, yes. He said, I will be killed, and it will be by somebody who has access to this villa, either by someone I know or by someone who somehow has access to the villa, maybe working here. And he was very, Vargas said that, when Trotsky said this to him, he felt himself somewhat depressed. He was very, very fond of Trotsky. And Trotsky noticed this and looked at Vargas and said, well, you seem unhappy. And Vargas said, yes, because you've told me something which is very disturbing to me. And Trotsky says, well, don't worry. In the end, I'll win. And you know why? And he said, why? He said, I'm smarter than Stalin. But he had immense respect. And I spoke to others, for example, the doctor who performed the final surgery on Trotsky. I even met, by the way, a lawyer who had only one client, and that was Mercader's Mexican lawyer, who Ceniceros was his name. And while there, I was able to find a letter that Mercader had just sent to Ceniceros. He was from the Soviet Union. Trotsky still loomed very, very large in the history of Mexico and its political life.
So Trotsky himself felt that the net around him was tightening, and we know from what you've recounted that the GPU infiltration of the Trotskyist movement is becoming really quite extensive. By this point, they have agents, Sheldon Hart in the house in Mexico, they had Zborowski in Paris, and we'll talk later about who they have in the American section. But do you believe there was any way that the assassination could have been prevented, or was it inevitable?
Well, I don't believe there's that type of inevitability. There's, the question really, no one can ever answer the question, or if the question is, could the assassination absolutely be prevented? I think one cannot say that. There's no absolutes of that sort in history. It was not either absolutely preventable, and it was not absolutely inevitable. One has to examine what occurred, and one can examine the circumstances under which the assassination took place. To go back to the question of how it took place, there was certainly a substantial and significant failure of security in a number of critical respects. I think the most serious, in one sense, and where the SWP was really deeply responsible, was the careless attitude that was taken to the selection of personnel to guard Trotsky. There tended to be, and Harold Robbins said this to me, that often they would select people who were not considered to be particularly needed in New York or particularly needed in any other critical area of party work in the United States, or maybe even somebody who was a bit difficult to get along with. And they would send such people down to Mexico. Why Sheldon Hart was ever selected to be Trotsky's guard, a person with no political history, no one knew anything about his background, that was absolutely irresponsible. And there was a sense, I saw a letter by one of the German secretaries who once referred to the SWP as being just incredibly naive about matters relating to the security of Trotsky. But if we come back to this question, because it was an important one, which you raised about this issue of the network. Well, what had happened? They got Ruby Weil to reconnect with Sylvia Agaloff, and she was absolutely critical in introducing, eventually, Mercader into Trotsky's entourage. Then we know that Robert Black, another member of the Communist Party who had been sent into the SWP, was supposed to go down to Mexico. He chose not to when he found out that what they wanted him to do was become involved in the plan to kill Trotsky. He claimed later on that he was already to some extent disillusioned and he did not want to be involved in the assassination of Trotsky, but he was told by his agent that there were other people, and he would be introduced to them when he got down to Mexico. And I'll come back to that shortly afterwards. We also know at the same time, and we mentioned this before, that just around the time that Ruby Weil was being recruited from within the Communist Party to play a role in the plot against Trotsky's life, another very critical agent was recruited, and that was, and perhaps in some ways the most devastating in New York, that was Sylvia Callan, whose husband, Zalman Franklin, was another intelligence operative for the GPU. And she was recruited from Chicago and sent to New York, where she very rapidly was allowed to work in the national headquarters. As a matter of fact, Albert Glotzer.
And who is Albert Glotzer?
Albert Glotzer, you have to keep on asking me these things because I say these names without explaining them. Albert Glotzer was a longtime member of the SWP, a founding member of the American Trotskyist movement from the Communist Party in the 1920s, Young Communist League. He went to Turkey in 1930-31 to visit Trotsky. He served as a stenographer at the Dewey Commission in 1937. Later on, he was to break with the SWP along with Shachtman in the 1939-1940 faction fight. But he, in 1937-38, met Sylvia Callan after she joined the party, and the only thing that was which struck him, was that she seemed rather unpolitical, and sort of wondered who she was, and she could not really explain to him what her political interest was. And he was somewhat shocked not long after when he went to New York to see this person working in the national office of the SWP. He didn't understand the basis upon which she had been so rapidly accepted to work in the national office, and from there very quickly became, to use a term common at the time, she became his Girl Friday. She became his absolutely indispensable personal secretary with access to everything. So they had people in New York. We know from Black that they had people in Mexico. And as we've made very clear, that critical person who they had in Mexico was Joseph Hansen, who himself had been approached by the GPU based on what he told the FBI in 1940. He was approached by the same Gregory Rabinovitz, using the name John, in 1938, and asked to become an agent of the Third International.
So this actually brings me to my next question. In the aftermath of Trotsky's assassination, what does the Socialist Workers' Party do? Do they launch an investigation to try to understand who has penetrated their ranks and how this happened? Joseph Hansen is down in Mexico. What does he do? What can you just tell us about those events that followed?
Well, there's one investigation which is launched, and that is under the supervision of Albert Goldman, who was from Chicago, an attorney, member of the SWP, recruited out of the Socialist Party. And he had also served as Trotsky's attorney in the Dewey Commission hearings of 1937. So he conducts the official party investigation, which is concentrated on the question of who was Jackson. Clearly, Jackson wasn't the assassin's real name, but their focus was to establish that the assassin was an agent of the GPU, and they put out a very important statement, a pamphlet devoted to establishing that as best as they could with the evidence available at the time. That was the investigation. There was another internal investigation which was carried out by the SWP. It consisted of taking depositions from various people, and that revealed, though it was not publicized, certain disturbing aspects of of Mercader's penetration of the circle around Trotsky. For example, when Cannon and Dobbs went down after the May 24th raid for discussions with Trotsky, they met with Mercader and apparently went out on the town with him one evening in June 1940.
And they had no suspicion of who Mercader was.
They had no suspicions, but even more serious, unless I've missed something, I've never, until this was included in a footnote in the book by Bertrand Patenaude, the professor at Stanford University, in his book on Trotsky's last period in Mexico, and he includes a reference to this in a footnote. I don't know of any acknowledgement by the SWP that such a meeting had taken place.
So Cannon never reported to his own organization that he and Farrell Dobbs, a fellow member, had had an evening out with Mercader.
No, and it doesn't. The fact that they had an evening out or went out with him is not something which suggests that they were in any way, and they were not involved in any conspiracy against Trotsky. But it does indicate, if this was not reported and not referred to, a great sensitivity and a sort of covering up of critical issues and lapses in security. It certainly was something which should have been made known.
So, in your view, why did Cannon and other
longtime leaders... One last point I want to make, because so there's the official investigation, and there's an internal examination of security issues inside the SWV, but then there's something else going on, which no one knew about until it was uncovered by the International Committee in 1975, when we first located a document which revealed that Joseph Hansen went down 10 days after Trotsky's assassination. On September 1st, he pays a visit to the American embassy, where he meets with the FBI resident agent at the embassy, Robert McGregor, and begins talking to him about the assassination. It marks the beginning of a series of discussions, monitored, among other things, by J. Edgar Hoover, in which Hansen winds up asking for a confidential contact with the FBI to whom information could be imparted with impunity. Now, until these documents were discovered, and they were discovered in the National Archives,
as part of the security in the Fourth International Investigation,
no one, as far as we knew, had ever known that Hansen or anyone else in the SWP had contact with the FBI. It seemed to us extraordinary that Joseph Hansen would solicit or claim to be could be soliciting the support of the FBI in the American state in an investigation into Trotsky's assassination at a time when the SWP was under increasing attack by the FBI, and they knew full well that a major legal operation or state operation was in preparation. This is just a little more than a year before 18 members are actually indicted on sedition. So we found this document and a series of other documents and demanded to know who authorized this meeting, who in the SWP knew about this. And
you actually, if I'm correct, you tried to speak with, and you spoke with some former SWP members to find out whether or not when they were in the leadership of the SWP, they knew about Hansen's meeting with the FBI or authorized it. Is that correct?
Nobody I spoke to knew anything about this, and in particular, one person with whom I had a very extended discussion on this question was Felix Morrow, who was a member of the political committee of the SWP, who ultimately went to jail. He was one of the SWP 18. He broke with the SWP in the mid-1940s, but he's a major figure in the history of the SWP, in particularly the 30s, early 40s. He wrote Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain. And I asked him directly whether it was the policy of the SWP to seek support or help from the FBI, and did he know of any contact between the SWP and the FBI in an investigation into Trotsky's assassination.
David, I'd like to actually play a recording of a conversation that you had with Felix Morrow on this question. I believe you rang him, and we're going to play that now. For the listeners, you will hear a sound of a telephone ringing and then that discussion.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Morrow.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Dave North again.
Yeah. I hope you don't mind, but there were a few questions I wanted to ask you, and you basically were about the only person I could think of who might be able to help me.
See if you can try me.
All right. Well, actually, it concerns the period right after the death of Leon Trotsky.
Okay.
And I was wondering whether or not you had any recollection about the steps taken by the Socialist Workers' Party at the time to try to learn more about the assassination, how it was carried out. Particularly whether it received any assistance from the American government in any way.
None.
None whatsoever?
None.
Well, first, what was the attitude, in your opinion, of the FBI toward the assassination?
They weren't involved in any way.
Well, did the SWP, to your knowledge, have any policy of trying to obtain the assistance of the FBI?
There would be no reason. It was an open and shut case. Jackson had done it. The only problem was to establish that Jackson was a gay PAU agent.
I see. To your knowledge, then, the SWP made no initiative at any time toward establishing a contact with the FBI?
None.
So, David, when you hung up the phone from that conversation, how did you feel? What came to mind? What did you understand from the information you just gotten?
Well, first of all, the discussion continued for some time for reasons, I suppose, of time we haven't played, and maybe we'll be able to put the entire interview on the internet so others can hear the entire discussion. Well, it confirmed what we suspected. I mean, Felix Morrow goes on to explain, first of all, because I then asked him directly about Joseph Hansen, and he made it very clear to me. He said Joseph Hansen was not on the political committee of the SWP. There would be no reason for him to be going down and meeting with the FBI, and he knew absolutely nothing about it. I actually then went on to ask him about the environment, and I asked him, was it the case that they were under pressure? They felt they were under pressure from the FBI, and he used the term the heat was on. They were under growing state attack. And so the idea that the Trotskyist movement was going to go to the FBI and get support was absurd, politically absurd. And the explanation given by, first of all, when we first raised this, we published only one document. And Hansen specifically belittled this one meeting he had with the FBI as if it was no big deal. We then went on to discover that he had at least another 5 meetings. As I said, they were monitored very closely by the FBI. Hansen then finally asks for a contact with whom he could to whom he could impart information with impunity, according to the documents. Hoover then sends instructions saying that Hansen should be, J. Edgar Hoover, he sends instructions that Hansen should be given the name of the resident FBI agent in New York, chief agent in New York, a man by the name of B.E. Sackett. And that's whom Hansen should meet. Hoover also says, of course, no information should be imparted to Hansen himself. So the idea that the FBI was going to help the Trotskyists in the investigation of Trotsky's assassination was absolutely unfounded. And Hansen was essentially the proverbial, they didn't know who Hansen was, who was really sending Hansen in. They're always suspicious of sort of the man who sort of walks in, on the ground floor and begins providing information. Is he an agent? Is he a double agent? For whom is he working? They were very, very cautious. One other point should be made about this. There's another document, which is, I think, in a way tears to shred the claim that this was in any way illegitimate. The FBI sends later that autumn an agent to the offices of the Socialist Workers' Party to meet with Cannon and Hansen. And he reports neither of them had anything to say. So they didn't want to talk. When Hansen is in Cannon's presence, he doesn't say anything. When Cannon's not around, in private meetings with the FBI, he's extraordinarily loquacious. So clearly, what he was doing was done without the knowledge of the SWP and clearly in violation of all political principles. The Revolutionary Party doesn't have private dealings with the state. If they sought information from the FBI, they would have done that publicly. They might have even demanded that the FBI make public whatever information they have about the GPU penetration of the Trotskyist movement. In fact, that was the procedure that Trotsky used when he wrote one of his final documents, the GPU on the Comintern. He wrote a public document addressing questions to the state.
Now, of course, at the time that Hansen is developing this relationship with the FBI, in which he also reveals, as you mentioned previously, that he had been approached in 1938 by the GPU, although he claims that he goes on to claim later, I understand, that he was authorized to have those discussions by Trotsky, who wanted him to find out some more information if he could, but you don't believe that. And I'd like to talk about that in a few minutes. But so the SWP didn't know that Hansen was engaged in this, but over the coming years, through the mid to late 40s into the 50s, there were revelations that were becoming public about the GPU's infiltration of the Trotskyist movement. And it's my understanding that the SWP had some information, not just from Soviet espionage trials happening in the United States, but also people who were close to the SWP, who had once been members of the movement, who sought to warn them about what the dangers were. So what were those warnings, and how did the SWP respond to those?
Well, here the timeline is important. In 1946, Louis Boudin's, who I had referred to, the former editor of the Daily Worker, active in GPU operations. And one of the really corrupt elements of the American Communist Party was the manner in which it lent its services entirely without restraint to the Soviet bureaucracy, to its police operations. At any rate, in this, Louis Boudin writes a book, This Is My Story, and provides information for the first time that the American Communist Party collaborated under instructions from the Soviet regime in the assassination of Trotsky. This was in the pages of the militant front page news. They accepted Boudin's testimony, publicized it. There was a very famous Laura Gray cartoon. Laura Gray was the great, wonderful illustrator and cartoonist, did many well-known cartoons for the militant in the 1940s and early 50s, of a picture of Stalin, and it says guilty. Now, so in the mid-1940s, initially through Boudin's, the story of Stalin's role and the American Communist Party's role in the assassination of Trotsky begins to emerge. Then, in 1947, and this is obviously a major event, Max Shachtman and Glotzer contact the SWP. Now, they've split, they're politically hostile, and yet they were, there was the famous Shachtman-Abraham Burnham split of 1940, what we know as the 1940 faction fight, the petty bourgeois minority, which left the SWP in 1940, and of course began a very different evolution. Shachtman ever further to the right, ultimately becoming a more or less foreign policy advisor for the AFL-CIO, the founder of a host of state capitalist movements. At any rate, he asked for a meeting in May 1947 with Cannon and other members of the SWP leadership, and he informs them that he tells them two things. He says that they have been informed. They have a contact in the FBI, or through someone who has a close contact in the FBI, someone whom they have found to be reliable. He has imparted to them information that Cannon's personal secretary, Sylvia Caldwell, is a GPU agent. This is reported by Cannon to the political committee. Cannon also states in this report that they had been previously told by Shachtman that there was an FBI agent highly placed in the leadership of the SWP. They then convene what is supposed to be a control commission. Later on, they would invoke this control commission as having absolutely cleared Sylvia Caldwell of any suspicions that there was her story was legitimate, it didn't conform to the information given them by Shachtman. Actually, the control commission, the entire control commission took place apparently in one evening. The entire report is a page and a half, and they clear her. The control commission was chaired by Cannon's wife, Rose Karsner. I think there's something inherently dubious about a control commission in which the chairman of the control commission is the wife of the national secretary of the party. At any rate, shortly thereafter, Sylvia Caldwell disappears, leaves the movement, is gone. In 1950, the issue of Sylvia Caldwell reemerges. Boudens now comes out with a second book, published in May 1950. It's called Men Without Faces. And now he tells in great detail the story of the Stalinist agent from Chicago who penetrated the national office of the SWP. The only change he makes is he doesn't refer to Sylvia, he gives her the name Helen. But everything else is there, the whole story of how she had been recruited in Chicago, sent to New York, how she was concealing her past. And this threw the SWP into its leadership into something of a panic.
How did they respond?
Well, they didn't respond. Well, initially, I'll tell you exactly what happens. They send Farrell Dobbs out to Illinois to meet with Sylvia. The report I see, Farrell Dobbs reports that she really doesn't want to talk about anything. She doesn't want to get involved. She acknowledges that she is being pursued by the FBI. She wants nothing more to do with the SWP. They ask her, or Dobbs requests that he help them write a statement. She doesn't want to write any statement, but then, and this is the most remarkable, she then tells them what they should write. She says, well, why don't you just say that you cleared me in 1947? And lo and behold, 1 week later, there is a statement that is published in the Militant, largely along the lines of the clearly lying statement dictated to them by Sylvia Caldwell. A few months later, in November, Boudens submits a sworn affidavit to the Senate, to a Senate committee, a House committee, investigating what they called American aspects of the assassination of Leon Trotsky, in which he now tells the detailed story of the recruitment of Sylvia Callan into intelligence work against the SWP. There is no response by the SWP to this. And throughout the 1950s, in both Senate hearings and in trials, the role of Sylvia Franklin, Sylvia Callan, maiden name Sylvia Caldwell, party name, is documented, established very clearly in testimony. The SWP says nothing publicly.
What you're saying is that for actually years there had been evidence around, growing evidence, and I believe also in many of the espionage trials of the 50s, there's also more information coming out about Zborowski and others into the 60s. The Soblin brothers, Jack Sobel and Robert Soblin, are also giving testimony about their involvement. So information is coming out.
Well, it culminating in 1960, Robert Soblin, the second Soblin brother, there was Jack Sobel, Senin, Robert Soblin, who had been well. Senin, Jack, was prosecuted in the early 1950s. In 1960, just to make this clear, these prosecutions by the American government concern essentially Soviet espionage against the United States. The United States is not particularly concerned about what was done against the Trotskyist movement. They're not prosecuting people for spying on the Trotskyists, even if those actions resulted in death. Their interest was only the intersection between the anti-Trotsky aspiring and anti-U.S. espionage. And there was a certain intersection. But in the course of these trials, not only is Zborowski's role revealed, but also many details come out about the penetration of the SWP. And far from the Stalinists being uninterested in the SWP, Jack Sobel testifies in the 1950s that he is overseeing a spy network consisting of 10 people. He himself in the SWP. He names 6.
We don't know who the other 4
No, we don't know who the other 4 are, but he names 6 of them. Then in 1960, when his brother is put on trial, there is a list of co-conspirators, what they call unindicted co-conspirators, people who were part of the espionage ring, but for one or another reason, generally because they provided state's evidence, they are not actually indicted. They're named as unindicted co-conspirators, and that includes Floyd Cleveland Miller, who had played a significant role in the maritime faction of the SWP, had gone down to Mexico and actually met with Natalia to work on the publication of Trotsky's biography of Stalin. Sylvia Callan is named as an agent as well. Now, again, keep in mind that these trials are being held a few subway stops away from the national headquarters of the Socialist Workers' Party. And nothing is being said about these trials by the SWP. Nothing appears in the Militant. There's complete silence about this. Now, if any of these people were being wrongly accused, if they were the victim of a frame-up, it would have been the absolute responsibility of the Socialist Workers' Party to defend them, to call upon the workers' movement to defend them. I mean, can one imagine the personal secretary of James P. Cannon named an unindicted co-conspirator and nothing being said about it in the pages of the Militant or in any of the tabloid press internationally? There's total silence on this question. Now, I think the most one of the most remarkable elements of the response to this comes in an associated event. The Russian-American journalist Isaac Don Levine writes a book published in 59 or 60 about Mercader called Mind of an Assassin, in which he tells the story of, as part of the story of Mercader, he refers to Zborowski,
the GPO agent stationed in France, who's responsible for...
Who was also brought to the United States by the SWP and continued to spy on the SWP throughout the 1940s.
So after Zborowski carries out his wrecking operation in Paris and oversees the death of the assassination of Trotsky's son in 1941, with the aid of the SWP, he ends up in the United States?
Dahlin goes to extraordinary lengths working with George Novak to bring Mark Zborowski to the United States. They actually create something of a forged affidavit. They bring this man to the United States, and he rapidly resumes his career as a spy. The FBI is really on to him from the late 1940s on, and this is significant. But because they have this information from a valued GPU agent who they've now turned and has become a double agent, a man by the name of Boris Moros, they choose not to make this information known. So they have reasons to stop this from happening.
So if you're just joining us, we're speaking here today with David North, chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. We're talking about the 75th anniversary of the assassination of Leon Trotsky and how that assassination was prepared through GPU infiltration that also involved infiltration of the Trotskyist movement by the FBI. You can help support the work of the World Socialist website by donating today. On the webpage through which you're listening to this interview, you can make a donation. In addition, if you go to the website mehring.com, you can purchase books on Security in the Fourth International, which is the investigation into Trotsky's assassination. You will also find there works of David North that he has written on the life and political biography of Leon Trotsky. David, I'd like to continue this discussion about the penetration of the American Trotskyist movement. So there's these increasing revelations, and James Buchanan, who is still active in the leadership of the movement, doesn't say anything. Why do you think that is? Did he just feel totally compromised or humiliated, or why wouldn't he have moved to attempt to rescue his organization?
I don't know if you can say rescue his organization. I think it's very hard to explain or give a definitive explanation of Cannon's response. Of course, I suppose one can attempt to imagine how he felt to discover that somebody with whom he had worked so closely, who he had treated as not just a comrade, a close family friend. If you look at, for example, the volume Letters from Prison, there are many references to Sylvia. He expresses concern about her vacations. It seems that she spent summers with his wife. I mean, it was obviously a close, personal friend, the type of relationship which develops when you are engaged every day in close collaboration. She has access to all his papers. She types all his documents. You know, she knows where everything is. So I think, in addition to the sense of deep personal betrayal, he also understood immediately the broader implications of this, that the security of the organization had been deeply compromised, if this were true, and that everything relating to the assassination of Trotsky, all the security measures which the SWP had taken in 1940, would have been given by Sylvia Caldwell to the GPU. And moreover, if it were true that she were an agent and the FBI was now on to her, there existed the possibility that when, in the course of its pursuit and when they talked to her, everything that she told the GPU, she will now be telling the FBI as well. So obviously there was a immense concern about that. I mean, you can think of all sorts of reasons why Cannon behaved as he did, but in the end, I mean, Cannon used to use the phrase, there's a good reason and the real reason. The real reason, the objective reason, was it was a political cover-up. And there's no question that the response, if there was questions as to the truth of the allegations in 1947, by 1950 there could no longer be any doubt. And whatever subjective excuse they may have concocted, we don't want to get people scared about agents, we don't want to undermine confidence in the organization. The action Cannon took was, from a political standpoint, utterly unprincipled, and in terms of the future of his movement, terrifically destructive, because whatever reasons he may have had, there were other people who had reasons of their own why they did not want to have any serious examination of the role of Sylvia Caldwell. After all, when the question immediately comes up, if she's in the national office, who else is there? Who is she working with? And this becomes particularly important in relationship to Joseph Hansen, because the principal source of the exposure of Sylvia Caldwell was Louis Boudin's. Now, when we raised the question of Sylvia Caldwell, and I have to come back to this because, like so many things in Security in the Fourth International, it was the response of the SWP which escalated the investigation. Remember, the investigation began because Hansen denounced the International Committee for taking basic security precautions after we learned that the National Secretary of our organization had entered into a personal relationship with somebody who had close family contacts with high-level personnel in the CIA. They started it. And they said that Hansen said that concern with security was paranoia. Only people who were sick would pay attention. So the question was not really that we were denouncing the SWP because it had been penetrated by agents. After all, they were up against a powerful state apparatus. For God's sakes, the GPU had penetrated British intelligence and more or less controlled it. But the issue was that when that information began to emerge, their response was to cover up and to lie. We're all familiar with the phrase used about Watergate. It wasn't the burglary that was significant. It was the cover-up that was significant. It's true here. It was the cover-up that became so questionable. Now, in the first set of articles, when they were written under the title,
1970s.
Yes, the first what we call the interim report, how the GPU murdered Trotsky, and reviewed the whole history as best as we could reconstruct it based on trial transcripts, Senate and House testimony, related documents of the buildup of the Soviet apparatus or the GPU apparatus within the SWP and within the Fourth International. We simply mentioned, somewhat in passing, Sylvia Franklin. And it didn't, since this was something which sort of was known about, it wasn't really entirely a revelation. There had been sort of rumors around that there had been an agent in the national office of the SWP. What was incredible was Joseph Hansen's response. His full-throated tribute to Sylvia Caldwell in 1975. And the tribute to Sylvia Caldwell by George Novak. And an absolutely over-the-top panegyric to Sylvia Caldwell, written and published in a book memorializing James Buchanan's contributions. Reba Hansen, Hansen's wife, writes this long, glorifying document about Sylvia Caldwell. So the question which we had to deal with was why? Why? And whatever they wrote about Sylvia Caldwell, they would speak about the perjurer Boudin's perjured testimony, that Boudin's had lied. Strangely enough, they hadn't challenged him except for one brief statement. They never challenged him. But this was something, whenever Sylvia Caldwell, it's the perjurer Boudin. So this escalated. We became more and more determined to uncover the truth, to settle for once and for all the question of who Sylvia Franklin was, why they were so determined to protect her, why they were lying about her. The problem was, to do that, we had to find out where she was. She had disappeared. We had to see if there were any documents which could be uncovered. Eventually, because of the indictment, we knew there were grand jury transcripts out there somewhere in which she had testified, but we didn't know how we could get them. And it didn't appear we would be able to get them. But at the same time, we were able, through a series of fortuitous events, actually, to find documents which established that at the time of her indictment, Sylvia Callan had lived in Wheaton, Illinois. And from there, we were able to reconstruct her movements, and finally, in 1977, established definitively that she had married in the 1950s a man by the name of James Doxey, created a sort of petit bourgeois life for herself in Illinois, and finally, in May 1977, we located her, of all places, in a trailer park in the Balboa Trailer Park in Wheaton, Illinois, and photographed her and spoke to her. She claimed complete amnesia, but of course when someone claims amnesia and says, well, James Buchanan wasn't important, why would anyone want to remember him? She had a very peculiar form of amnesia. And later on, because of the very, very courageous initiative taken by a member of the SWP, Alan Gelfand, who independently sought to obtain answers from the SWP leadership about the allegations made by the SWP. Eventually, he was expelled. He was told to shut up. They wouldn't answer his questions and expelled him. He charged then that his expulsion was undertaken by agents, and he used lawsuit to uncover very, very critical documents, which absolutely substantiated the position of the International Committee.
I'd like to talk in a little bit about this case, which is known as the Gelfand case. But prior to moving into that, I have sort of a political question. I know that the SWP broke with the International Committee of the Fourth International, the movement that publishes the World Socialist website. And they are also an organization which is infiltrated by agents of the GPU, by agents of the FBI. What is the relationship between their political break with the International Committee, the politics that they began to adopt, and the fact that they are an organization, you could say, crawling with agents?
Well, I think there always was a very powerful political dimension. The question really which comes up is why, given the fact that it should have become absolutely clear that the allegations, the questions being raised by the International Committee were completely legitimate. And we were, after all, calling for a commission of inquiry. We asked the Pabloid organizations to join us in the formation of a commission.
Sorry, who are
the Pabloites referred to the tendency that split from the International Committee, led by Michel Pablo and Ernest Mendel. The basic element of that tendency and its political orientation was, in one sense, a pro-Stalinist split in the Fourth International. They had adopted the position that Trotsky's evaluation of Stalinism was no longer valid, that the communist parties and the Soviet bureaucracy could play a potentially revolutionary role. And from that standpoint, and the orientation of these organizations, they didn't really want to have to talk about the crimes committed by Stalinism. They didn't want to have this issue raised again. It cut across all sorts of political alliances which they were forming. That was true of the SWP. It was true of the Pabloid organizations in Europe. So there was this, of course, political components which was very significant, and they didn't, for them, the discussion of the crimes committed by the Soviet bureaucracy raised again the issue of the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism, and they wanted those questions to be looked upon as things which belong to the distant past, not relevant to contemporary politics.
And what was the interest of the FBI in the organization? I mean, could you talk a little bit about the politics of the Socialist Workers' Party?
Well, the Socialist work, I think just one element of this which one has to keep in mind in terms of the general background of this making the SWP's attitude toward security and its hostility to the issues being raised by the International Committee all the more disturbing was it was known by the early 1970s that the SWP had been massively infiltrated by the FBI. The COINTELPRO revelations, or the COINTELPRO program of the FBI, had targeted the SWP in particular, as it had targeted the Communist Party. But I think the figure was that between 1961 and 1974, something like 1,000 agents and informants had passed through the SWP. So for an organization with that type of situation to be denouncing the International Committee as paranoid for evincing or for raising the issue of security was another thing which was really, if they were legitimate, inexplicable. But I think the question which one, if I can, must come back to is the following. When we talk about Sylvia Franklin, why did they insist on defending her? That has to do with Boudin's, and as was to become clear in the course of the investigation, and particularly through the efforts of the Gelfand case, because what happened when Alan Gelfand, who was an attorney, initiated his lawsuit, and the lawsuit was solidly grounded on constitutional issues. He said that he was expelled from the SWP by agents attempting to stop his exposure of agents. And that was unconstitutional. Agents didn't have a right to expel members of a party in order to protect their operations. It was a violation of the First Amendment, and the judge accepted that argument. She said this was unconstitutional. And the case then went on and had to face a number of motions for summary judgment. Now, summary judgment, in preparing to meet this test of summary judgment, you have to establish, I think in legal terms, that there is a factually grounded case that must be heard by a trier of fact, jury or judge. Gelfand sought discovery. And he sought to take the deposition of people who would have information relevant to the charges he was making.
Who did he want to depose?
Well, he was going to depose people like Morrow, people like Farrell Dobbs, who could answer questions as to whether, for example, they knew about Hanson's meetings with the FBI. And he deposed, and I believe this is most critical, he deposed, or sought to depose, Mark Zborowski and Sylvia Doxy.
Sylvia Doxy.
Sylvia I know she has a lot of names.
A lot of names.
Doxy.
Okay.
Now, I just want to make the point. Now it's accepted that Sylvia Doxy was an agent, but very rarely is it acknowledged. Number one, that Sylvia Doxy was defended vehemently by the SWP, and that the Gelfand case not only obtained her deposition, in which she pleaded, I think there were 232 questions to which she pleaded amnesia, but ultimately was able to obtain the grand jury transcripts of 1954 and 1958, in which, particularly in 1958, where Sylvia Doxy acknowledged and confirmed that she had indeed been an agent of the GPU, and the story told by Boudin's was absolutely correct. It should be pointed out that the Socialist Workers' Party went to court to try to quash her deposition. They tried to prevent Gelfand from taking the deposition of Sylvia Doxy, and later on, they went into court to try to prevent the release of the grand jury transcripts. Now, if you recall that the International Committee first charged the SWP, Hanson, and Novak with being accomplices of the GPU, and by that we meant they were covering up for the operations of the GPU. In the course of the Gelfand case, they wound up doing exactly that. They actually sought to prevent us from getting her transcripts, from finally answering the question definitively. They didn't want that.
It's my understanding that not only did they try to block getting her deposition and the release of the grand jury transcripts of Sylvia Caldwell Franklin doxy, but they also attempted to block Mark Zborowski giving a deposition too.
Yes, we deposed. We issued a subpoena to Mark Zborowski, and oh my God, at that point, the International Committee was supporting Gelfand's lawsuit against the SWP because we believed it was a principled case that he was pursuing. And so Mark Zborowski, living in San Francisco, was deposed. The SWP went to court to try to quash his deposition. They did not want him questioned. That failed. And so in April 1982, we finally had Mark Zborowski, this murderer, in a room, and we had the opportunity to question him. He then pled the Fifth Amendment, and he did so on very interesting grounds. He said that he did to answer questions relating to his actions and to answer questions about the penetration of the SWP by agents, to identify agents, or to give information that would lead to the exposure of agents, would place him in violation of the newly passed Agents Identity Protection Act of 1982. And on those grounds, he should not have to answer questions. After all, what would we asked him? And we made these points, or Gelfand's attorneys made these points in their own submissions. They said that he will be asked about Joseph Hansen, he will be asked about Lola Dolan, he will be asked about Sylvia Franklin. He's going to be asked questions which can lead to the uncovering of agents in a very direct way, substantiate the allegations which Gelfand is making. The SWP collaborated with Mark Zborowski's attorney, James Larson, in drafting the legal briefs upholding Zborowski's argument. This should be as clear as it can be to everybody. The deposition of Mark Zborowski provided the Trotskyist movement with the first, last, and only chance it would ever have to question a man responsible for the murder of leading personnel in the Fourth International, the murder of Lev Sedov, Rudolf Clement, Erwin Wolf, Ignaz Reis, and Trotsky himself. We had him in a room. The Socialist Workers' Party collaborated with his attorneys, and in the lawyer's submissions, he acknowledges the support he received from the Socialist Workers' Party to block his deposition. That was itself, that action by the SWP was nothing less than criminal. Those who were associated with it were engaged in politically criminal activity. That was the last opportunity the Trotskyist movement would ever have to question Mark Zborowski and uncover critical facts relating to his actions. Two more things have to be said about the secretary of the SWP, Jack Barnes.
He was the secretary at the time of the Gelfand case.
Yes, and he defended this action. He said that it was his job to defend the rights of American citizens, even people like Mark Zborowski. He was rather loquacious. He apparently didn't expect that the judge would release the grand jury transcripts, and in his testimony, when questioned about Sylvia, do you have the quote there?
I do have the quote, actually. When questioned about Sylvia Franklin Caldwell, Jack Barnes says her whole comportment, not only when she was in the movement, but everything that's happened since she left, indicates that she is exactly what she was, a loyal, hardworking, and model member of our movement. My opinion today is she is one of the heroes. She is one of my heroes after the harassment and what she's been through in the last couple of years. I would even feel more strongly about her character than I did then.
Yes, and I think about an hour later, the judge released the transcripts identifying Sylvia Caldwell, in her own words, as an agent of the GPU.
Do you think the judge did that in response to Barnes' testimony?
I think, I don't know. I mean, Judge Felser recently died, so we'll never know, but I think she probably had about all she could take. I mean, she did not find for Gelfand, and that's itself a complicated issue, but she knew that Barnes was lying, and I think his testimony must have been in some way disgusting to her. That's not all that came out, because I want to come back finally to this sort of maybe the mystery question. Well, why then did they defend her? Well, there was another document which came out in the conclusion of the Gelfand case, and that is that a letter was written by a man by the name of Vaughan T. O'Brien, a former member of the SWP, a close friend of Joseph Hansen. We obtained that letter through a subpoena. It was released. And in that letter, Vaughan T. O'Brien recalls that he met a woman by the name of Pearl Kluger. She also had associations at one point with the Trotskyist movement, later left. But he reports to Hansen that Pearl Kluger said that she met Vaughan T. O'Brien, and Pearl Kluger says to Vaughan T. O'Brien, Boudin says your friend Joe Hansen is a GPU agent. Later, the SWP would acknowledge that Boudin's had in fact made such an allegation. So the story sort of comes together. Boudin's identified Sylvia Caldwell. He identified Joseph Hansen. To acknowledge the truth of the allegation against Caldwell would legitimize the accusation against Hansen. But there's one difference. Boudin's identifies Caldwell publicly. He does not identify Hansen publicly. And our explanation for this is that since 1940, Joseph Hansen had been providing the FBI with information, and they decided to leave him in place. He was an informant, working a source of information.
So you don't believe Hansen ever stopped informing the
Well,
FBI?
we have found the documents when he began informing. We never found a document which indicated that he stopped. There's no document that we've ever come across which says Joseph Hansen is no longer informing and providing us with information. So I think the conclusion is fairly powerful and irrefutable, and it explains why Hansen was so bitterly determined to defend Caldwell, even though the evidence against her was overwhelming.
David, what do you think the political implications are of these questions of security? Why would somebody who is a Trotskyist, a Marxist, somebody becoming a socialist, a member, a worker becoming politicized, be concerned about these issues of security and their political implications?
Well, to answer this question, one has to grasp what the underlying issue is. What are we talking about in the end? We're talking about the state, the nature of the state, the nature of the counter-revolution. The argument, which was made by some in the SWP as a rationalization for not dealing with these issues, is that, you're just going to scare people. You're going to frighten them away. You're going to sow distrust. And in order to pursue that, they created all sorts of incredible arguments. For example, they said, it doesn't really matter if there's agents. They're still working on our behalf, and they had this phrase they used again and again in the 1970s. I heard it so many times from members of the SWP. Agents do good work. In other words, why worry about them? As long as they're selling the paper, raising money, maybe doing some propaganda on behalf of the party. They're getting the line of the party out, so who cares? They're helping us. As a matter of fact, among the FBI agents in the SWP, and he exposed himself, was a man by the name of Ed Heisler, and he provided thousands of pages of information to the FBI. He was the man who testified on behalf of the SWP at hearings on the question of FBI penetration and CIA penetration of left-wing movements. They sent him there. The senators must have been aware of who he really was, because one of the senators asked him if he wanted to have all information released regarding agents, and Heisler couldn't give a direct answer to that question. But they had this very cynical attitude. Agents do good work. So, you don't have to worry about that. I recently read an article on the role of Zborowski where that argument is made again, that it was better to have Zborowski working on behalf of the Fourth International than engaging in a spy scare of some sort. Well, the answer to that is that at least 4 leading members of the Fourth International were murdered by Zborowski. And how can you claim that it's absurd. It's an insane argument that he could somehow be still helping the Fourth International. That was one argument which they developed. The other argument is that, you'll just have continuous spy scares in your organization. This is an argument, again, for having no security. It's not a question. I mean, an organization where there is no seriousness taken toward these questions will be an organization which is at the mercy of the state. It's a question of training, of education, of developing appropriate procedures where, if there are concerns, they can be properly investigated. And it is important, I think, in a period such as we are living in today, that in a period of intensifying social conflict, a renewed movement of the working class, that there is an understanding of the role of the state, the tragic experiences of the past, so that lessons can be learned from them. That is the critical issue. And it's part of our history, and we have to learn from it.
David, if I could just ask you one final question. Not just the SWP, but many organizations who called themselves left-wing denounced the International Committee and its investigation and its findings. Where are those organizations today? What political role do they play?
Well,
Maybe
that's
a long question.
Look, the SW. I want to make this point very clear. The political differences between the Workers' League and the SWP were of a fundamental character. But the issue of security was not raised from the standpoint of finding an issue to attack the SWP. It arose out of political questions. The fact that these organizations, however, so bitterly defended Hansen, lied outrageously, had to do with their political orientation, their hostility to the political independence of the working class, their hostility to all matters of revolutionary principle. And in the decades since the investigation was begun, they have moved violently to the right. I mean, there's not the Socialist Workers' Party is not, and has long since explicitly repudiated Trotskyism. We now refer to many of these organizations as a pseudo-left. They have evolved ever more explicitly into essentially middle-class parties, parties of a more privileged layer within the middle class. They have nothing in common with revolutionary politics in the working class. Their orientation is not towards socialist revolution. They are disinterested in questions of these great historical questions of our movement. And they continue. I mean, it should be pointed out that many elements of the basic story of the narrative of the assassination of Trotsky was told by the International Committee. Our work was central in exposing the role of Zborowski, the role of Sylvia Franklin, agents within the Fourth International. Those who slandered the International Committee have never retracted their slanders, and they persist to this day. And we will still be answering and clarifying these questions.
So you'll be writing more on this?
Yes, we will be. There'll be more, and there's more information which is coming out. And as one reviews, one thing which is striking when one reviews these, in fact, the documents of the past, things really leap out which one didn't sort of recognize at the time. But the investigation has stood the test of time. I think it was an enormous achievement. It was a collective achievement. I want to make clear this was an initiative of the International Committee. I'm very proud that I played a role in it. There were others, certainly Alex Mitchell, who long ago parted from this movement, but Alex Mitchell at that time played a very, very substantial role in the initial stages of the investigation. And Jerry Healy always insisted on the great significance of the historical questions. He said many times the Trotsky question was the great question, that the movement had to come to grips with the role of the counter-revolution, the role of Stalinism, the crimes it had committed, and whatever his subsequent errors and limitations, I think that the Trotskyist movement will always record with great appreciation the role he played in particular in initiating this investigation. He often spoke of the assassination of Trotsky, learning of that assassination, what a tremendous blow it was to the cadre of the Fourth International. And he was not one man who was going to forget. He was not going to forget what had been done. And so I think that if one looks back after so many years, 40 years after the investigation began, it has stood the test of time. I challenge anyone to come forward and show us where that investigation was incorrect, false, wrong. Given the difficulty of acquiring information at the time, I think it is astonishing how accurate it was, how close we came on so many questions to uncovering what was subsequently to be proven with other documents released through sources, particularly after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991.
David, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. It's been a really fascinating discussion on Trotsky, his history, and the circumstances surrounding his murder and the penetration of the Trotskyist movement. So thank you very much.
Glad to be here.
And I'd also like to thank our listeners. You can donate to the World Socialist website to support this work on the webpage through which you're listening to this interview. There's also a survey on that webpage that we'd like to know more about your interest in the World Socialist website. If you'd like to purchase any of the books associated with security in the Fourth International or the works by David North on Trotsky and his political biography, you can do so at Mehring.com. Thank you very much.